When it comes to video games, creating a good love letter to a genre is incredibly hard. You not only have to create a good game in its own right, but you also have to appeal to a specific set of tastes, ones that have very likely been at least somewhat blinded by nostalgia. So you have to be very careful to only include things people genuinely liked about those games, because if you go all in, you'll likely find that not everything people say they loved in the past holds up quite as well. The best love letter games understand this and distill the best qualities while filtering out the bad ones. The most disappointing ones are ironically usually more faithful, having effectively planted their flags in the ground of decades past, ignoring the evolution that occurred in that time. And that's where Cris comes in. This game was designed as a love letter to classic JRPGs, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I do love a lot of those games. But on the other hand, a lot of those old ideas and mechanics were abandoned for a reason, so we'll have to see if Cris is able to build on that and turn it into something incredible, or if the past is best left behind. Anyways, hey people, it's ScionVyse, and let's take a look at Cris. I really like the opening cinematic here. It's gorgeous and does a lot of what these sorts of scenes do, basically acting as a trailer for the game when you first boot it up. I really don't mind though, as it looks incredible and does a good job of showing off a lot of the people and places you'll be seeing throughout the game in a way that doesn't spoil where or when you'll be seeing them. The game proper cold opens with a battle, which is a really weird decision. I understand not wanting to waste too much time getting into the action, but we're just going to be doing this battle over again in a few minutes, so I really don't see the point. Like, literally, this bit could have been completely cut and nothing would have been lost. Once that's done, we get the actual opening and we take control of our protagonist Cris outside of her orphanage. The intro here is pretty good, all things considered. It gets started fairly quickly and introduces the game's main gimmick nicely. Cris is the chosen one, apparently, considering the stained glass mural in the cathedral seems to be her, and she awakens the ability to see into the past and future, which is shown in-game by dividing the screen into 3 parts. These being the past on the left, present in the center, and future on the right. This is a really cool concept and is used in a few different ways. Just on its own, it's used in environmental storytelling, which is one of my favorite things games can do. It uses the past and future to basically tell stories without saying a word. You get to see what people were like in the past, and their designs usually hint at what motivated them to become who they currently are. And you can see what they will eventually become. At least what they may become, as the future isn't set in stone after all. It can actually get kind of somber when seeing into the past and future. Like, when you look at a child's past, they aren't there as they had yet to be born, but on the other hand, if you look into an elderly person's future, they may very well not be there either, having died before that future could come to pass. I adore this concept. One of the things I always wonder about in fiction is, what did a character's choices lead to? Did they make the right decisions, or is something they did going to end up haunting them? Not only can you peer into that with Cris, but it actually lets you change those futures. On top of visual storytelling, the time crystals have gameplay applications as well. This is an RPG, so you'll be going around doing quests and helping people as you travel. This will often involve the time crystals themselves. Now, Cris can see into these futures and pasts, but can't actually interact with them. That's where Matthias comes in. Matthias is a friendly talking frog that helps Cris awaken her powers, and himself has the ability to time hop between these periods. Occasionally you'll need to grab an item or listen to a conversation in one of these time periods, and Matthias will be the one to do that. That's pretty much all he'll do though. I feel like they could have done a lot more with this mechanic. Like, there could have been a mechanism over a bridge, but the bridge collapsed, so Cris would have to send Matthias into the past, where he could then cross the bridge and activate the mechanism, which would open a new path in the present. That's a really simple one too, but Cris doesn't even go that far with it. Cris does get one thing she can do by herself, which is manipulate the time state of certain objects. She can take a collapsed stone pillar and return it to its original state, or decay it into dust, that sort of thing. Again, it's really basic and isn't explored too deeply, but it does have more interesting applications than the time hop, so there's that. And that's kind of it for uses of the time powers themselves while just walking around. Obviously, since this is a JRPG, there's some more traditional JRPG stuff here too. There's an overworld to walk around in and explore, there's some shops to buy items and upgrade your equipment, and inns to sleep in to recover your health. And of course, there are side quests, which I think deserve a bit of focus on their own. Side quests are a JRPG staple, and no game handles them in the exact same way. Some games go crazy and give you dozens of side quests that give experience or items, but don't usually affect the world at large much. On the other hand, some games have fewer, more deliberately made quests that do have a big impact on the world. Cris Tales leans heavily towards the latter. Cris Tales only has 10 side quests. Because the number of quests is so low, you'd think they'd all be unique and meaningful, right? Well, most of them are meaningful as you are directly helping people and changing their futures, but a lot of the quests themselves are far from unique. Most of them involve going from place to place, finding a thing, sometimes in the past, and bringing that thing back to the person who asked for it. Now, obviously, whether or not you do side quests is entirely up to you, but this game's kind of put me in a weird position where I don't know if I should actually recommend doing them. See, at the end of each area you'll be given a choice. Don't worry, I'm not going to be spoiling what those choices are, and the idea of these choices is established at the end of the tutorial area. Normally you'd have a choice between two different options that each had their pros and cons, and you'd actually have to weigh your options and decide which option does the most good, while knowing your choice will still lead to suffering. But if you do all the side quests in an area, you're given a third option, which is basically just, why not both? It lets you get a happy ending for everyone, and it completely destroys the, oh, you may need to make some hard decisions, you can't always make everyone happy idea that was established in the first area. You actually need to do this to get the best ending as well, so the hard decisions stop being decisions at all if you're doing everything. It's a cop-out, and it lessens the emotional weight and burden that these powers were supposed to be on Crispell. But honestly, the fact that the end-of-area choices don't end up being that meaningful is one of the smaller gripes I have about the game. Unfortunately, Cris Tales does so many things wrong that it's genuinely pretty hard to actually appreciate all the things it does right. Let's start with Crispell's signature abilities, seeing into the past and the future. The triangular split between all three eras is always there in towns, and there's no way to simply toggle between either one for a better view of each time. If a character is standing next to a wall on any side of the screen and you want to see what they look like in a different era, it's very hard to do that normally. Even just a button to see either time on their own would be huge, but no, for some reason the game that made a huge emphasis on its art and using time to see things in different periods makes it really hard to do that. Now you can go into the past or future on their own with Matthias's time hop, but that adds another problem. Matthias is slow as hell. So yeah, you can use him to go into the past or future, but once you're there, you slow down to a crawl so you can't really explore anything. Honestly, the only reason I think you can't swap between times faster or dismiss the crystals at all is to force you to use Matthias, which, let's say, is a bad decision to justify a weird one, but we'll dissect the frog a little bit later. And it's not just Matthias that kills the pace. Everything in this game takes so long that it feels like I'm always playing the game in slow motion. Crispell's running speed is abysmal and it takes forever to get from A to B. In some games, a slower run speed can lend to a sense of scale and size, but the world here doesn't feel big. Crispell is just slow. Even the menus and pop-up messages are crazy slow too. Like, look at this. I've entered a town and I want to use Crispell's power to grab an item. But Matthias can only time hop when he's physically close to her, and he moves even slower than Crispell does, so when I go to use the power, this pop-up happens. This pop-up, which gives no more information than a little symbol in the corner with a sound effect would, takes 4 seconds. And this shows up every time you try to do a time hop when Matthias isn't close enough to Crispell. It really feels like this game has no respect for the player's time, to the point where it actually commits several sins for JRPGs. So I get to the 4th main area and the party splits, basically as a way to force me to use a couple new party members, which is totally fine, happens all the time. But on top of losing all of the equipment on those party members while they're gone, after I finish the required dungeon and get the other couple ones back, I see this. Party members in Cris Tales don't get experience when they aren't directly used in battle. This actually kind of makes me angry because this decision isn't made to improve anything in the game. It doesn't encourage you to swap out party members more, in fact it does the opposite. Basically, if you don't have a different team every battle, you'll get some party members falling behind, and the more they fall behind, the more of a burden they'll be in battle, which makes you less likely to want to use them. All this does is make you stick with one team forever or force you to grind. The way I see it is if a game makes you grind in order to get your team fighting fit to complete the game, it's wasting your time, and not giving background party members experience wastes your time. The inclusion of random battles doesn't really help with that feeling either. I don't inherently hate random battles. They can add to the experience in games that use them in a smart, interesting way. The Pokemon series is one I'll always point to that uses them really well. The mystery of which new monsters you'll find would basically be completely gone if Pokemon got rid of them entirely, and on top of that, it's basically always obvious when the random battles can occur. But for the vast majority of games, especially nowadays, random battles are strictly a hindrance. They're just constant pace breakers, stopping you from doing what you want and going where you need to go. And there's no way to change how many battles you get into either. Octopath Traveler had random battles as well, but it wasn't as big of a deal because you had direct control over the encounter rate. You could run through an area which would increase the encounter rate, but you get from place to place faster, or you could walk, which was slower, but drastically reduced the chances of getting into battles. Just copy and pasting that into Cris Tales would significantly improve the experience of working your way through dungeons by reducing encounter rates when you want it and letting you move faster when you want it, which is desperately needed. I'm not exactly done ragging on all the things I don't like about the game just yet, but that's pretty much everything that doesn't directly involve the battle system. And with that, I think it is about time we start talking about the battling, because just like everything outside of it, there's a lot of cool ideas and it does a lot of things that are really interesting, but it makes a lot of bad decisions too. Cris Tales Combat is a fairly basic turn-based system heavily inspired by Super Mario RPG. I think that it actually handles the timed hit system a little bit better than Super Mario RPG because the game gives a small visual cue when you need to press the button and a sort of ranking that shows how close you were to hitting that timing. That being said, while being more approachable, the timing system in Cris Tales isn't that deep. It's the same single A press for almost every move in the game, so aside from maybe one or two characters that have a few unique inputs, the timing system doesn't offer much in terms of fun or mastery in and of itself. Speaking of the party, by the end of the tutorial area you have Chris Bell, Christopher the Elemental Mage, and Wilhelm the Natural Mage. You get a few more as you go, like the robot JKR721, which the party nicknamed K for some reason, Zas the Wild Card, and a sixth that I won't name here because it's a story spoiler and I want to go over their introduction separately. Each character has their own gimmicks and are all useful for different reasons and in different ways. Christopher has elemental magic, so he can take advantage of weaknesses often. Wilhelm can poison enemies and scan for their stats. JKR721 has a special heat meter that can increase his damage output on some of his attacks, but can hurt the party if he overheats. And Zas is basically the Keshi of this game, having all of her abilities be randomized or based on a roulette in some way. And lastly, there's Chris Bell herself. Being a time mage, she gets a lot of time-based skills. She can speed up allies, slow down enemies, and she even gets a few really cool skills that lets her revert enemies or allies to the state they were in the turn before. HP, status effects, everything. This is really cool and is unfortunately the best use of time abilities in the game. Chris Bell is also the party's best healer, and considering how wonky the game's economy is for items and their usefulness, you're probably just better off having Chris Bell heal every turn than even bother with items. Seriously, most items end up being pretty useless. Tents are way too expensive to be worth buying early on, and in the late game, Cris Bell's healing abilities render them a waste most of the time. And the only other item I found to be worth using was the cup of coffee, which gives a speed up on whoever uses it. The only things you should really be spending your money on are pieces of equipment and weapon upgrades, both of which are very useful. The price of tents was fixed in a patch, but it was still an issue when I played. There are a few other small things that bug me about the combat system, like not being able to stack certain status effects. I don't know why lowering an enemy's defense cures their burn, but I guess that's just how it is, and the fact that there's no way to swap out party members in battle, so if you go into a battle without a character that can scan enemies, you just have no way to know their HP or weaknesses. This can be a bit of an issue for bosses, because Wilhelm is kinda useless there, and JKR721 is always a risk due to his heat meter. But honestly, the biggest problem I have with the battle system involves the time mechanics. I wouldn't go so far as to say that they screwed it up, but they definitely left a lot of potential on the table here, and it really shows. In battle, whenever her turn comes up, Cris Bell can activate one of her time crystals. With this, she can send enemies on the left side of the screen to the past, and ones on the right to the future. That's it. Now, there's a few cool things to have this be more meaningful. Some abilities get affected by the time shifting, like Wilhelm's plants, which grow or have their effects accelerated by time moving forward. Each enemy also has a separate version for each era with a different sprite and different stats. So you'd think this would lend itself to a lot of cool strategy, right? Well, not really. An example. In order to, say, poison the entire left side of a battle, you have to first get to Cris Bell's turn and use her power to send that side to the past. Then Wilhelm has to set up his poison. After that, you have to wait for Cris Bell to have another turn and burn her turn again just to break that crystal. So to do something as simple as an AoE poison skill, you have to use 3 of your allies' actions. Most of the time, it's simply more effective just to use those turns to attack enemies, which will probably kill them faster anyways. If this was something Cris Bell could do freely once per turn, it wouldn't be that bad, but as it is, man, it just was almost never worth the turn investment. And on top of just being a hugely inefficient option, it's very rarely strategically advantageous. The stat changes to enemies is very rarely noticeable, and there's a huge amount of enemies that simply don't change at all when you move them to the past or future, so why even bother doing it at all? You know, it would have been amazing to use the time crystals on your party and change how they played. Like, if you used the past crystal on Christopher, he'd get quicker and dodge attacks frequently, but lose some spells due to being young and inexperienced. And if you used the future crystal, his speed and defenses could drop significantly in exchange for hugely more powerful magic. I honestly think that using the time powers to change your party as well would have been far more interesting than just having slightly different variants for most enemies. It would have at least made me more likely to actually try to use it. And that's all my complaints about the battle system itself mechanically. Now there's something else that bugs me just as much, but you probably wouldn't be able to tell just by looking at it. I've brought up Persona 5 a lot on this channel, and for good reason. It's not perfect, but if there's one lesson any RPG released after 2017 should have taken from it, it's how important it is to not only have your RPG menus and UI look great, but to have them be intuitive and functional. Cris Tales definitely gets an A for effort in the visual department, but I feel like the team forgot to consider how these visuals would actually function in-game and how that would affect the player. Firstly, let's say you're choosing an attack on an enemy on the right, but you decide that you actually want to target an enemy on the left with that attack. Oh wait, you can't do that. For some reason, Cris Tales decided that if you want to change sides for an attack, you have to completely back out of all skills and start from scratch every time. Or if you're using Wilhelm and you want to use anything, instead of just listing the skills right from the skills menu, you have to go through a convoluted tree of various menus to even reach any of them. Oh, and for some reason, different UI messages like damage numbers all play sequentially and can't overlap at all. So if you say use JKR721's flurry move that hits a single enemy a couple dozen times, No other damage numbers from any other action will show up until every single number pops up on its own. So until that clears out, you just won't know how much damage anything does. Yes, I understand that on their own, these are all small issues that could probably be fixed with patches, but they add up, and because they're so omnipresent throughout the game, despite initially being small, they end up being far bigger frustrations than you'd think. Alright, enough with the negativity, let's talk about some things that Cris Tales does do really well, which again, aside from those small issues, is the presentation. Cris Tales goes for a very vibrant and colorful hand-drawn art style that basically always pops. It uses a lot of flat colors, and one thing that I really like is the fact that basically nothing has the typical dark outline that a lot of other 2D art has. It really works here because it lets objects and characters blend into the world, so that you could basically take a screenshot and it'll never just look like a bunch of art assets dropped onto a background. The character designs are also incredible. I basically love every single one and can't name any that I thought were bad. Even the enemies, like I said before, most enemies have multiple unique designs for each era, and if anything, it was cool to use the time crystals to see what they'd look like, and there were some surprises there that I frankly was not ready for. And the animation is so good. Honestly, if the animation was choppier or was just not as well done as it is, the game simply wouldn't pop as much as it does. It's a testament to hand-drawn animation for sure. On the audio side of things, it's not as impressive, but still not bad. The sound effects do the job, but again, don't really blow my mind. The menu sounds are probably a bit too harsh for my ears, especially in a game that's as soft and smooth as this, but that's a huge nitpick to be sure. Voice acting is mostly fine. I thought the main cast generally did a good job, but there was some pretty wonky line delivery from some of the side characters, like they didn't get proper direction of how they were supposed to sound.
Sounds like someone's been telling you stories about Ash Blight.
Overall though, it's fine, and I'm glad that they put in the effort into recording voice lines for every piece of dialogue in the game. Music is also pretty good. Most of the game's music was composed by Tyson Wernley, although the game's main theme was done by Norihiko Hibino. It's all orchestral and uses a lot of cool leitmotifs that recur throughout the game. The boss theme, The Crow's Murder, and the ancient city of Neva Tulira are clear standouts for me, but they're all pretty great. And with that, I think it's about time we head back towards the story. There honestly isn't that much to talk about. It's very traditional in terms of its JRPG storytelling, at least for the most part. But regardless, I'm still going to put a timestamp somewhere in the video here if you want to skip it. So, here we go. Let's start with the characters. Overall, I'll say they were fine. They're all fun and likable, and while they're mostly tried and true archetypes, that's not necessarily a problem. Cris Bell is the optimistic protagonist, Wilhelm is the grizzled no-nonsense veteran, JKR 721 is the robot that learns how to feel, that sort of thing. The cast beyond the main party is mostly fine too. Again, there's no reinventing of the wheel going on here, but that's completely fine and everyone serves the story well enough. Where we left off, Cris Bell just got her powers and things were starting to happen pretty quickly after that. Her town gets attacked and Matthias brings her to Wilhelm for some advice. Cris Bell is given the Sword of Time, which is important for some reason, but is never brought up again. After a few battles and Christopher's introduction, Cris Bell and the crew are chased out of town, but they have a goal. The Empress of Time was behind the attacks on the town, and the team wants to stop her before she can cause any more destruction. That's largely the overall plot for the majority of the game. Each individual city has its own small stories that are somewhat tied into it, like St. Clarity, where the Empress has installed her own minion to corrupt the local religion, and is using another to mine materials for her armies. Or Neva Tulira, where a follower of the Empress is trying to usurp the city's leading family, which would give her control over all of its wealth and influence. They're fine and are probably where the game shines the most narratively. It starts to lose a bit of steam in the latter half, however. It's not like there aren't important events though. Eventually the party reaches the city of Crystallis where the Empress is stationed. They confront her, but it's no use, she's invincible. But Wilhelm has an ace up his sleeve. It turns out he wasn't a natural mage at all. He was a powerful time mage who had done battle with the Empress in the past, but was defeated and only survived by freezing himself in time. In one final gambit, he uses all of his remaining life to destroy the Empress's barrier, and though he dies, the Empress is now vulnerable. But despite defeating her and being at the final area, the game still has not one, not two, but 3 globetrotting bits to do before we're done. Okay, so how do they try to justify this narratively? Well, the Empress had basically rigged the world to explode after defeating her, and it does. Cris sees this happening and uses all of her power to go back in time before it happened. This starts the first one, disabling the exploding ruins. Then you fight her again, and after defeating her, the bombs don't go off and her plans to save the world have failed. Wait, what? Yeah, so this is where the story starts to get really confusing and starts to go off the rails a bit. So the ruins that the Empress was trying to explode, they belonged to an ancient race that was technologically far superior to anyone else, even thousands of years later, but despite this was somehow wiped off the face of the earth by the humans. There is one survivor that has been plotting to revive this race while killing all other civilizations, and the Empress was trying to stop that. This rogue element, this villain of villains trying to do a super genocide? Matthias the Frog. Yeah, this was a twist for sure, but it kind of came out of nowhere, aside from like that one line at the start of the game. After the Empress dies and her plan to stop Matthias, real name Ardo, has failed, he sheds his disguise, announces his plans to the party, and then goes into the final boss arena to inevitably wait for a final boss fight. But what was the deal with the Empress? Well, she sorta comes back and gives some exposition to Cris. The Empress is, in fact, Cris herself from the future. She knew about what Ardo wanted to do and was determined to stop it at all costs. So how are they both around at the same time then, when Cris was able to go back in time and not have a double, while the Empress kinda just hand waves it away by saying that timelines don't split until some arbitrary point of time, when the personalities change or whatever. It's actually been a cycle for ages with Cris trying to stop Ardo. Even the world's religion of the Lady was formed around a Cris, which has all sorts of implications. Like, an alternate Cris started a false religion that the entire world now follows just to kill this guy. Hoo boy. And our Cris is just another one brought from a different timeline to unknowingly help with the cause. You may be thinking, hey, this doesn't really make that much sense, and yeah, you'd be right. I guess it kind of takes the Dragon Ball approach to time travel, where if you travel back in time, you're effectively in a different universe, once you hit the arbitrary point at least. When it's just one person traveling back and forth, yeah, that makes sense, I guess that's kind of fine, but it's heavily implied that there's been countless Cris over eons that have just been going back and forth through the multiple different timelines, all converging on this one. And when it gets to be that convoluted, it's just kind of hard to care. Oh, speaking of the time travel, I need to talk about the final party member, Karihudo, Zas's sister. She spends most of the game being a villain as a servant of the Empress, but after she kills Narim's mother superior, Cris reverts her back to a child, and not having any memory of what happened later in her life, she joins the party. However, by the time you get her, all that's left to do is the endgame cleanup stuff, and since she's the most complex character mechanically, I never really bothered to try to learn how she worked. Anyways, we've got busy work to finish. First, you need to go and find certain NPCs in each area and bring them to the door that Ardo has locked himself behind. Then, from their advice, you have to go back to each ruin again and do a small mini dungeon with a boss fight. 2 of these are rehashes of previous ones, but the other 2 are new, and admittedly, they are really cool. With that finished, all that's left to do is beat up Ardo, who has definitely not just sat around waiting for a final boss fight to happen at the end of the game. The fight against him is super tedious and annoying, not because it's incredibly hard, but because he's got a lot of obnoxious moves that force you to spend a lot of your time just not fighting back. He can drop your party's HP to 1, and he can cause the burn status as well, which, if not immediately healed or reverted, can mean a wipe of your team. So Cris is on healing duty every turn, and the other two party members often have to take time to regroup as well, making the fight just drag on. That's not even mentioning his move that can just OHKO the entire party if you're unlucky. And after you punch him in the face, he's defeated but not giving up. After some more timey-wimey hand-wavy nonsense about, oh, the rules we established are actually different when things are big, Cris has a plan. Instead of allowing Ardo to copy and paste his civilization over the existing one, she thinks she has the ability to bring his people and world into the present without destroying the current one. But in order to do that, she'll likely have to sacrifice her life. She does, and effectively creates a separate planet for Ardo to go to and live his life in peace with his people. Now, I'm no physicist, but this is gonna end very badly for everyone. And that was Cris Tales. Oh, this game is frustrating. It's frustrating because I can see every bit of potential it has, and I can see how much effort and passion it went into making it. This is a small indie game after all, made by two very small studios, in a country that isn't really known for its game development. And it's frustrating because even as it is, so many individual aspects of it are just a few small tweaks away from being great. But all of these small issues just compound into much bigger problems that are far harder to ignore. And that's ignoring other small issues like typos or actual bugs that pop up from time to time, or how the save menu doesn't have the same layout everywhere. I fully believe Cris Tales has the makings of a fantastic JRPG, time travel story shenanigans aside, but it's not quite there. To be clear here, I don't just want it to become a different game. All the things that I genuinely think need to be changed are all rather small and wouldn't genuinely affect the overall identity of the game. Other things like the proposed battle mechanics that I came up with are more cool what-ifs rather than actual suggestions. More for a possible sequel if that were to ever happen. Ultimately, Cris Tales is a decent classic JRPG that, in attempting to be a love letter to the classics, it fails to learn any of the lessons those classics had to teach. This leaves a game that may appeal to the hardcore JRPG enthusiasts that grew up playing these games from the late 80s to mid 90s, but feels particularly out of place nowadays compared to most of its contemporaries, even ones that aim for a similar niche. I do wish the team the best, and I genuinely hope the game is successful, I really do. I really want the team to have a second chance to make a second game because there's just so much potential here and there's so many cool things they could do. They just weren't able to get it all done in this game. Anyways, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you all later.